They said no. Sarah Bradley told her sister at 2 in the morning, her voice stripped of everything except exhaustion. The hospital said no. The administration said no. Every single person with a name badge and a clipboard said no. But Connor is 16 years old. He weighs 74 pounds. He has one leg and he is dying. And the only thing he has ever asked for, the only thing, is to meet the HELLS Angels. If this story moved something in you before we even get started, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. Connor Bradley had never been the kind of kid who asked for much. That was the thing his mother Sarah kept coming back to in those hollow hours between midnight and dawn, when the oncology ward settled into its particular silence, that mechanical hush of monitors and ventilators, and the distant soft footsteps of nurses doing their rounds. Connor had never been demanding. Not as a toddler, not as a little boy growing up in their small house on the east side of Spokane, where the winters came hard and the money came slow, and Sarah worked double shifts at the diner on Sprague Avenue so they could keep the heat on and the lights burning. Not even after the diagnosis 14 months ago, when the world, as both of them had understood it, simply stopped existing, and something else took its place, something harder, colder, and completely without mercy. He had never asked for anything he didn't think he deserved. That was Connor. So when he finally asked for something, Sarah listened. She was sitting in the chair beside his bed, the chair she had practically lived in for the better part of a year, the one with the cracked vinyl armrest. She kept meaning to ask someone to replace, and never did. When Connor turned his head toward her and said in that voice that had gotten quieter and quieter over the past several weeks, "Mom, I want to meet the HELLS Angels," Sarah thought she had misheard him. "What baby?" "The Spokane chapter," he said. "I looked them up. They have a clubhouse. It's on the north side. I want to meet them before I—" He stopped. He had gotten better at stopping himself before he finished that particular sentence, and Sarah had gotten worse at pretending she didn't know how it ended. "I just want to meet them," he said. She didn't ask him why that night. She just reached over and took his hand. His fingers were so thin now, so light in hers. Nothing like the solid, rough-palmed hand of the little boy who used to drag her toward every dog he spotted on the sidewalk. And she said, "Okay, sweetheart, let me see what I can do." She told herself she was humoring him. She told herself it was a phase, a strange teenage fixation that would shift into something else by morning. She told herself a lot of things in those first few hours. None of them turned out to be true. Dr. Kenneth Harrison was not an unkind man. Sarah had spent enough time in his presence to be certain of that. He was precise, careful, thorough in the way that all good oncologists had to be, the kind of doctor who gave you information straight because he respected you enough not to wrap it in cotton wool. And he had been honest with Sarah from the beginning, back when Connor first came in complaining about pain in his right knee that everybody had assumed was a sports injury and turned out to be osteosarcoma. Bone cancer, aggressive, advanced, and by the time they caught it, already spreading. Harrison had been honest then, and he was honest now when Sarah found him in the corridor outside the nursing station at 7:30 on a Thursday morning and told him what Connor had asked for. He didn't laugh. She had been half afraid he would laugh or give her the particular look that said he was deciding how to manage her, and she had been ready to fight through both reactions. But he didn't do either. He just looked at her steadily for a moment and said, "I hear you, Sarah, and I understand what this means for Connor. But I need you to understand that this is not a decision I can make unilaterally." "Then who makes it?" "Hospital administration, risk management, legal in all likelihood." He paused. "Bringing members of an outlaw motorcycle club into a pediatric oncology ward. I'm not saying it can't be discussed. I'm saying it will need to go through proper channels." "How long will that take?" Harrison didn't answer right away, and the silence where his answer should have been told Sarah everything she needed to know. She requested a meeting with hospital administration that same morning. She sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor across from a woman named Patricia Voss, who had the title of Patient Experience Director and the manner of someone who had absorbed so many institutional talking points that they had replaced whatever individual responses she might once have had. Patricia Voss had a binder. She opened it. She referred to it frequently. "We absolutely understand the emotional weight of these situations," Patricia Voss said, "and our hearts go out to Connor and to your entire family. However, our responsibility is to maintain the safety and well-being of all patients and staff, and bringing in outside individuals with documented criminal associations presents a liability that we simply cannot. He's 16, Sarah said. I understand that. He weighs 74 pounds. Mrs. Bradley. He lost his leg in March. Sarah's voice was steady. She had made a decision somewhere in the corridor outside Harrison's office that she was not going to cry in this room. Crying would give Patricia Voss something to manage, and Sarah did not want to be managed. He has never once complained. He has never once asked anyone for a single thing he didn't absolutely need. And now he is asking for one thing. One. And you're sitting here with your binder telling me about liability. Patricia Voss set her pen down. For just a moment, a genuine, unguarded moment, something human moved across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of institutional policy. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Bradley. Our hands are tied. Sarah walked out of that conference room and stood in the hallway and breathed through her nose for 30 seconds the way her sister used to tell her to do when the anger got too big to hold. Then she took out her phone and called Connor's room. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was foggy. They had adjusted his pain medication again the night before, and mornings were slow for him now. Hey, Mom. Hey, baby. How are you feeling? Like I ran a marathon, he said. It was an old joke between them, the kind of dark humor that terminal illness either breaks you out of or forces you into, and it still made her chest ache every time. Did you talk to them? She closed her eyes. I'm working on it. A pause, then, Mom, you don't have to, Connor. I mean it. You don't have to push yourself. I know it's a weird thing to ask. It is not weird, she said firmly. It is exactly the right thing, and I am going to make it happen. Okay, just give me a little more time. She could hear him exhale slowly on the other end of the line. Okay, he said. Okay, Mom. She hung up and stood in the hallway of Spokane Memorial Hospital and made a decision that would change both their lives. The story of Connor's fascination with the HELLS Angels did not begin with a news story or a documentary or something he had stumbled across online. It began with a photograph. Sarah had found it tucked in the bottom of a shoebox in the back of her bedroom closet 3 years after her husband Michael died, a photograph she had never seen before, never known existed. Michael Bradley had died when Connor was 9, a car accident on the I-90 just east of the city during a November ice storm, and Sarah had spent the years since then carefully, methodically building a life for the two of them out of the wreckage. She didn't go through Michael's things obsessively. She moved through grief the way she moved through most things, with determination and forward motion, because stopping felt like drowning. But she had been looking for Connor's birth certificate one afternoon when she found the shoebox. And inside it, wrapped in a cloth that had once been part of a flannel shirt, she recognized was the photograph. Michael, young and grinning, standing in front of a line of motorcycles with his arm around a man twice his size, a man with a beard that reached his chest and a leather vest covered in patches, the largest of which bore the distinctive death's head of the HELLS Angels. Both of them were laughing at something off camera, the easy laugh of two people who knew each other well. On the back of the photograph, in Michael's handwriting, were 4 words brothers before everything else. Sarah had sat on the edge of her bed for a long time looking at that photograph. Then she had put it back in the shoebox and put the shoebox back in the closet and not mentioned it to anyone. But Connor had found it. He had found it on a rainy Saturday about 2 years before the diagnosis, when he was going through old boxes looking for a baseball card collection, and he had brought the photograph downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway, holding it, and asked his mother who the men were. Sarah had told him the truth, as much of it as she knew, that his father had been connected to the club in some way she didn't fully understand, that the photograph was old, that she didn't know the man in the vest. Connor had looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he had asked if he could keep it. She had said yes. From that day forward, the photograph lived on Connor's nightstand. Through middle school and the first year of high school and the first months of illness, when everything changed so fast it left both of them gasping, the photograph stayed right there. Connor never talked about it much. He didn't dramatize it or build theories around it the way some teenagers might have. He just kept it close, the way you keep something that connects you to a part of yourself you're still trying to understand. The diagnosis came in the fall of his sophomore year. Pain in the knee that everyone assumed was a sports injury, then an X-ray, then an MRI, then a biopsy, then a conversation with Dr. Harrison in a small office with bad lighting and a box of tissues on the desk that Sarah had stared at for the entire duration of the conversation, because she had decided early on that she was not going to reach for it. Osteosarcoma. bone cancer. Stage 3 at presentation, which meant it had already begun to spread, which meant the window for aggressive treatment was narrow and the odds were not good, and they needed to begin immediately. They began immediately. Connor went through everything without complaint. The surgeries, the chemotherapy, the weeks of nausea and exhaustion so complete that he sometimes couldn't lift his own arms. The amputation in March when the cancer in his right leg had progressed to the point where the limb could no longer be saved, and Connor had woken up from surgery and looked at the space where his leg had been and said with a steadiness that broke Sarah's heart in a way that nothing else quite had, "Okay, what's the plan?" There was always a plan. That was the thing about Connor. He wanted to know what came next. He wanted something to move toward, even when what came next was another round of chemo, even when the plan was just get through today. But by the time they reached the fall, the plans had changed. Harrison had called Sarah into his office without Connor, which was how she knew before he said a single word, and told her that the cancer had spread to Connor's lungs, his spine, his liver, that they had exhausted their treatment options, that what remained was a question of comfort and quality of life, and making sure that Connor had time to say what he needed to say and do what he needed to do. How long, she had asked. Harrison had been honest. He always was. Sarah had driven home from that appointment and sat in her car in the driveway for 45 minutes before she trusted herself to go inside. That evening, Connor had asked her about the HELLS Angels. She had assumed in those first days after the conversation with Patricia Voss that there was still a path through official channels. She wrote emails. She made phone calls. She spoke to a patient advocate who was sympathetic but ultimately helpless, and a hospital chaplain who offered to pray with her, which she accepted because she was not in a position to refuse any kind of help. She reached out to a local news station. She had seen other families in impossible situations turn to media attention and find that the spotlight changed what bureaucracy could not, and a very young reporter came and sat with her in the hospital cafeteria and listened and took notes and told her sincerely that he would see what he could do. None of it moved. The wall was solid in every direction she pushed against it. On the 5th day, Connor had a bad night. Really bad, the kind that happened now, with increasing frequency when the pain broke through even the medication, and the night nurse had to call Harrison at home, and Sarah sat beside Connor's bed holding his hand and watching his face and talking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, just talking so he could hear her because she had learned that the sound of her voice was the thing that grounded him when everything else went sideways. By 3 in the morning, he was resting again, exhausted and pale, and smaller somehow than he had been even the day before. And Sarah was sitting in the cracked vinyl chair watching him sleep when she looked at the photograph on his nightstand. She had brought it from home weeks ago when it became clear that Connor wasn't leaving the hospital again, and something inside her simply broke open. Not in grief, in resolve. She was done asking permission. She had been asking permission her entire life. She had asked permission in Michael's family where she was never quite the right kind of person. She had asked permission from employers and landlords and school administrators and insurance companies and every institutional structure that had ever put itself between her and something Connor needed. She was done. She reached into her purse and took out the photograph and held it under the thin lamplight beside Connor's bed and studied the face of the laughing man in the leather vest. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. She knew nothing about him except that he had known her husband and called him brother, and that whatever that meant in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, it meant something real. She was going to find him. She was going to walk into the HELLS Angels clubhouse on the north side of Spokane, and she was going to stand in front of whoever was in charge, and she was going to tell them about her son. And then she was going to see what happened. Connor stirred in the bed and opened his eyes just barely, just enough to find her in the dim room, and said in a voice blurred with sleep and medication, "You're still here." "I'm always here," she said. He smiled slow and soft, the smile that still looked so much like Michael's that it stopped her breath every single time. "Good," he said, and then he closed his eyes again. Sarah sat in the dark and listened to him breathe and made her plans. She told no one what she was going to do. Not her sister Karen, who would have tried to talk her out of it. Not Harrison, who would have been obligated to report her plan to administration. Not the young reporter who might have followed her with a camera and turned the whole thing into something other than what it needed to be. She went alone. She waited until the following evening when Connor was stable and medicated and sleeping, and the night nurse, a steady woman named Donna, who had been on the ward for 11 years and who Sarah trusted completely, had done her checks and settled in at the station. Sarah leaned over Connor's bed and kissed his forehead and straightened the thin hospital blanket across his shoulders and walked out into the corridor and down the elevator and out through the main entrance into the Spokane night. The rain hit her immediately. Not a drizzle, a real Pacific Northwest assault, the kind that came in sideways and soaked you to the skin before you'd made it 10 feet from the door. She hadn't thought to bring an umbrella. She got in her car and sat for a moment listening to the rain hammer the roof, and then she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. She had the address. She had looked it up the same night Connor made his request, memorized it the way she memorized everything important, the names of his medications, the times of his scheduled doses, the direct phone numbers for every member of his care team. She didn't need to look it up again. She drove north through the rain. The streets were mostly empty at that hour. And Spokane in a November rainstorm has a particular quality. The wet pavement throwing back the orange glow of streetlights, the trees black and bare against the dark sky, the whole city pulling inward against the weather. Sarah drove with both hands on the wheel and her jaw set, and her mind very still the way it got when she had made a decision and was past the point of second-guessing it. The building announced itself before she fully registered what she was looking at. A long, low structure set back from the street, industrial, in character with a gravel lot in front, and motorcycles, so many motorcycles lined up along the front wall, even in the driving rain, covered in tarps and gleaming under the security lights. A flag above the door that she couldn't quite make out in the dark and the rain. Light around the edges of the windows, warm and amber. The sound of music, low and muffled, reaching her even through the closed car windows and the noise of the storm. She sat in the parking lot for almost 4 minutes. She was afraid. She was not going to pretend to herself that she wasn't afraid. Everything she had ever been told about this place, this organization, this world, the news stories, the documentary footage, the accumulated warnings of a lifetime was sitting in the back of her mind, loud and insistent. She gripped the steering wheel and breathed through it. Then she thought about Connor's face when he said, "I want to meet them." The quiet certainty of it. The way he had looked at her as if he already knew she would find a way. She got out of the car. She walked through the rain to the front door of the HELLS Angels clubhouse and she knocked. The man who opened the door was enormous, not just tall, but broad, with arms that strained the sleeves of his t-shirt and a face that had been rearranged at some point by something it had encountered and had settled into a permanent expression of assessment. He looked at her, this slight, soaking wet woman in her 40s, standing on his doorstep in the rain, and he didn't say anything, just looked. "My name is Sarah Bradley," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "My son Connor is dying. He's 16 years old and he has cancer, and he has asked for one thing before he goes. He wants to meet the HELLS Angels." She paused. "Let that settle. Then, I am not leaving until I talk to whoever is in charge." The man stared at her for a long moment. The rain came down between them. "Wait here," he said, and he closed the door. She stood on the step in the rain and waited. And she did not move. The door opened again after 6 minutes. Sarah knew it was 6 minutes because she counted. She counted the way she had learned to count everything in the past 14 months. Doses, days, test results. The number of times Connor's chest rose and fell when the pain was bad enough that she needed to know he was still breathing. Counting was the thing her mind did when it needed somewhere to go that wasn't forward and wasn't back. 6 minutes in the rain on the doorstep of the HELLS Angels clubhouse on a November night in Spokane, Washington, and then the door opened again and the big man was back. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her the first time, like he was deciding what category she belonged to. "Dave Rollins," he said, "Sergeant at Arms, come in." She followed him inside. The warmth hit her first. The room was close and loud and smelled of cigarette smoke and motor oil and something that might have been chili cooking somewhere in the back, and there were men, a lot of men in various states of attention, some at a long bar along one wall, some at tables, some standing in clusters. Every single one of them wore a leather vest. Every single one of them had turned to look at her. Sarah Bradley walked into the middle of that room and stood straight and met every pair of eyes that found her and did not look away from a single one. Rollins stopped about 10 feet in and crossed his arms. You said your name is Bradley. Sarah Bradley, yes. Your husband have a name? Michael Bradley. She watched his face. Something shifted there, something small and fast that she almost missed. He died 7 years ago. Ice storm on the I-90. Rollins was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room had gotten quieter too. The particular quiet that falls when people who don't usually stop talking decide they want to hear something. Michael Bradley, Rollins said again, more to himself than to her. You knew him. It wasn't a question. The shift in his face had already answered it. I knew of him, Rollins said carefully. He was a prospect, back before my time as sergeant. He paused. He was only with us a short while before he stopped himself, recalibrated. Before he passed. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket. The photograph had been in there since she left the hospital, wrapped in a square of paper towel, because it was the only thing she had to protect it from the rain. She unfolded it and held it out. Rollins took it, looked at it, and something happened to his face that she had not expected, something that went past recognition and landed somewhere older and more complicated. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up at her. Where did you get this? I found it in Michael's things after he died. Connor found it later. Connor is my son. She held Rollins' gaze. He's 16. He's been in Spokane Memorial for the past 11 weeks. He has bone cancer, osteosarcoma, and it has spread to his lungs and his spine and his liver. The doctors have told us we are out of options. She said all of it flat and clean the way she had learned to say it, because if she put any inflection into it at all, she would not be able to finish. He lost his right leg in March. He weighs 74 pounds. And the only thing he has asked for, the only thing in 14 months of surgeries and chemotherapy and more pain than any kid should ever have to know, is to meet the Spokane chapter of the HELLS Angels. The room was completely silent now. Rollins looked at the photograph one more time. Then he handed it back to her. Wait here, he said. For the second time that night, he walked away from her. She waited. Men moved around her, not toward her. Just around her the way water moves around something fixed, and nobody spoke to her, but nobody made her feel unwelcome either. A man about her age with a red beard brought her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one, set it on the end of the bar nearest her, and went back to where he'd been standing. She picked it up and held it in both hands and let it warm her fingers and waited. Rollins came back in less than 3 minutes. He'll see you, he said. She followed him down a short hallway and through a door. Thomas Henderson was a big man going gray with a beard that had probably been black once and was now the color of iron and eyes that were a very clear, very direct blue. He was sitting at a table with a cup of coffee in front of him and nothing else, no papers, no laptop, no props of any kind. And he looked at Sarah when she came in with the full, unbroken attention of someone who had learned a long time ago that most things worth understanding required you to look at them directly. Thomas Henderson, he said, people call me Grizzly. Sit down, Mrs. Bradley. She sat. Dave tells me your boy wants to meet us. Connor, she said. His name is Connor. Henderson nodded once, acknowledging the correction. Connor. How old did you say? 16. He'll be 17 in February. She stopped. The doctors don't think he'll make it to February. Henderson looked at her steadily. He didn't offer condolences. She appreciated that more than she could have explained the absence of the reflexive, I'm so sorry that she had heard so many times in the past year that the words had lost all shape and meaning. He just looked at her and let the weight of what she'd said sit in the room between them, real and undecorated. Tell me about him, Henderson said. She hadn't expected that. She had expected negotiation or refusal, or the same bureaucratic circling she had gotten at the hospital. She had prepared for those things. She had not prepared to be asked about Connor. She told him. She started with the photograph, how Connor found it, how old he was, how he had carried it in his pocket for weeks before she noticed and asked him about it. And then she went backward into Connor's childhood and then forward through the diagnosis and the treatment and the amputation and the months in the hospital. And she talked about the way Connor had handled all of it with a steadiness that still stunned her, a bedrock determination that she had never fully understood because it didn't come from her and it hadn't come from the version of Michael she had known. And as she talked, she began to understand in a way she hadn't fully articulated, even to herself, that Connor's connection to this photograph in this club was a connection to a piece of his father that she had never been able to give him. That the reason he wanted to meet these men was not about motorcycles or leather or any kind of teenage mythology. It was about being close to something his father had been close to. It was about not dying without having touched that part of himself. She said all of this to Thomas Henderson, who listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the room was quiet. Henderson turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow, deliberate rotation, once, twice, and then he looked up at her. "Your husband," he said. "Michael, you know what kind of man he was." Sarah felt the question land differently than she had expected. There was something in the way he asked it, not aggressive, not leading, but genuinely probing, like a man who was about to say something he needed to say carefully. "I thought I did," she said honestly. "I'm not sure how much I knew about this part of his life." Henderson was quieter for a moment. "He came to us as a prospect about 2 years before he died. He was serious about it. Good man. Worked hard, kept his word, didn't talk when he shouldn't." Another rotation of the cup. "He also had a temper. He did some things during his time with us that weren't things I'd want to describe to the boy's mother." He held her gaze. "I won't lie to you about who he was, but I'll tell you this, the night before he died, he called me from the road, said the roads were bad and he was going to pull over and wait it out." Henderson paused. "I told him not to be a coward, drive through it. He didn't look away. That was the last conversation I had with Michael Bradley, and I have thought about it every day since." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. Sarah sat with it. She sat with the information that Michael had called ahead, that he had tried to be careful, and that someone else's voice had sent him back out into the storm. She sat with the strange, terrible intimacy of knowing this. She sat with the fact that the man across the table from her had been carrying this for 7 years and had just handed it to her, and she thought about what it cost him to do that. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. Her voice was steady. She was very tired. Henderson nodded. "I owed you that." He was quiet again for a moment. "Then the hospital won't allow it. Us coming to the boy. The hospital administration refused. Liability concerns." She couldn't quite keep the bitterness out of those 2 words, but she tried. "I've been trying to work through channels for over a week. Nobody will move." "What exactly did your son ask for?" "To meet the chapter, to see the bikes, to—" She paused because this was the part that was hardest to say out loud, the part that lived closest to the center of what Connor actually needed. To feel like his father's son. "That's what I think it's really about. Whatever Michael was to this club, however complicated that was, Connor needs to know that that part of his father was real, that it mattered, that he came from something that mattered." Henderson looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up. He was bigger standing than sitting, and Sarah had to resist the reflex to lean back. He walked to the door and opened it and leaned out into the hallway and said, "Dave, get everybody." She heard Rollins's voice from somewhere down the hall. "All of them. All of them," Henderson said. He came back and sat down. "We're not going to do this through channels," he said. "We're going to do this right, but I need you to understand something first." He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped into something quieter and more direct. "When we come to that hospital, we're going to come the way we come everywhere. Together, all of us, the way we do things. That means it's going to be loud, and it's going to be visible, and the administration is going to have about 30 seconds to decide whether they want to make a problem out of it, because we're not going to ask permission. Your boy asked for the HELLS Angels. He's going to get the HELLS Angels." Sarah stared at him. "You're going to come," she said. "You're actually going to come." "Was there a version of this conversation where we weren't?" Henderson said. He picked up his coffee cup. "Tell me when." She told him. She gave him the ward, the floor, the visiting hours, and how to navigate around them, and Henderson listened and nodded and didn't write anything down, and she understood that men like him had built their lives on the ability to hold information in their heads without needing to be reminded. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the door himself. Rollins was in the hallway, and behind him down the corridor, she could hear the sound of the full-room men's voices, the scrape of chairs, the particular energy of a group that has just been given a direction to move in. At the door, Henderson stopped her. "Mrs. Bradley," he said. She turned. "The coin." He was looking at her pocket at the slight shape of the photograph she had returned there. Michael had a coin, club coin, sergeant at arms issue, death's head on one side. He was carrying it when they processed when they cleared the scene. He paused. It should have gone to his family. It didn't because nobody knew to look for the family. I've had it since. He reached into the front pocket of his vest and held it out to her. She looked at the coin in his palm, silver worn smooth at the edges, the death's head design still sharp at the center. She recognized it not because she had seen it before, but because Connor had described it to her once from the photograph, the glint of something in Michael's hand that she had always assumed was a trick of the light. She took it. It was heavier than she expected. "Give it to the boy," Henderson said, from his father. Sarah walked back to her car through the rain with the coin in her closed fist, and she sat behind the wheel for a long time before she was steady enough to drive. Not because she was falling apart. She had made a decision about falling apart a long time ago, that she was going to do it in private and in her own time, and not 1 second sooner than she chose to. But because something had shifted in the last hour that she was still trying to understand. She had walked into that building expecting to beg and had instead been heard. She had walked in expecting refusal and had instead been given a promise. She had gone looking for something to bring back to Connor and had come out with a piece of his father that she hadn't even known was missing. She drove back to the hospital with the coin on the seat beside her. Connor was awake when she came back to the room. It was past midnight and he shouldn't have been awake, but he was propped up against his pillows with the lamp on low and the photograph in his hand, the way he sometimes was when he couldn't sleep and didn't want to call for the nurse. He looked up when she came in, and he read her face the way he had always been able to read her face, the same radar that had told him as a small boy when she was scared or shown or stretched too thin, even when she was doing everything she could to hide it. "Mom," he said, "what happened?" She sat down in the cracked vinyl chair and leaned forward and put both hands around his and looked at him. "They're coming," she said. Connor went very still. "I talked to the president," she said, "a man named Thomas Henderson. They call him Grizzly." She watched Connor absorb this. "He knew your dad, Connor. He knew Michael." She opened her other hand and held the coin out between them. "This belonged to your father. The club had it. Henderson wanted you to have it." Connor looked at the coin. He didn't reach for it immediately, just looked at it the way you look at something when you need a moment before you can touch it, when the weight of what it represents is something you need to prepare yourself for. Then he picked it up and held it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. He blinked it back, the same reflex she recognized, the same learned steadiness, and he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be normal, "What's he like, Henderson?" "Honest," Sarah said. "Straightforward. He didn't give me a single thing I didn't ask for, and he didn't take away a single thing I came with." She paused. "I think your father meant something to him." Connor turned the coin over in his fingers. "When are they coming?" "We're working out the details." She reached over and straightened the blanket across his lap, the habitual gesture of a mother who needed something to do with her hands. "Soon, baby, I promise." "Soon." He nodded. He was looking at the coin again. "Mom," he said quietly, "yeah, I knew you'd figure it out." She looked at her son, this thin, brave, impossible boy, and she thought about all the things she wanted to say and couldn't, all the words that existed for this moment that she would never be able to put in the right order. So she just reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from his forehead the way she had done since he was small, and she said, "Of course you did." He smiled, closed his eyes. The coin stayed in his hand. She sat beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and tried not to count the breaths. Tried and failed the way she always did. But tonight the counting felt different. Tonight it felt less like keeping watch over something she was losing and more like bearing witness to something that was still against every odd here. In the morning she had phone calls to make. She had a hospital administration to navigate a ward, to prepare a plan to execute that had no precedent in Spokane Memorial's policy manual, and was going to require every ounce of determination she had left. She had nurses to recruit to her side and a doctor to bring into confidence, and a whole institutional machinery to either root around or drag along by force of will. She had all of that waiting for her in the morning. But right now, Connor was breathing, and the coin was in his hand, and somewhere on the north side of Spokane, a room full of men in leather vests were making plans of their own. And for the first time in 14 months, Sarah Bradley did not feel alone. Sarah made the calls at 6:30 in the morning. She made them from the family lounge at the end of the oncology ward, a small room that smelled of old coffee and hand sanitizer, and the particular exhaustion of people who had been keeping vigil too long. She sat in the corner chair with her phone and her list. She had written the list on the back of a hospital menu because it was the only paper she had, and she worked through it methodically the way she worked through everything that mattered. Dr. Harrison first. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already at the hospital or hadn't slept, and she told him what she had done and what was going to happen, and she waited for the reaction. There was a pause, a long one, Sarah, he said, you went to the clubhouse yourself. Yes, another pause. Are you all right? I'm fine, Kenneth. I need to know where you stand on this, because they're coming whether the administration approves it or not, and I need to know if you're going to help me manage it or if I'm doing this alone. She heard him exhale. Then, what do you need from me? She told him. She needed him to make sure Connor's pain management was optimized for the day. She didn't know exactly when the angels would arrive, but she needed Connor to be present, to be awake enough to experience it. She needed Harrison to run interference with the nursing staff to get Donna assigned to Connor's room for the day if possible. And she needed him to be the one to tell Patricia Voss, because if Sarah walked into that office again, she was not confident she could stay civil. I'll handle Voss, Harrison said. He said it in a tone that suggested Patricia Voss was not going to enjoy the conversation. And Sarah, what you did last night, going there alone. He paused again. That took courage. No, Sarah said, it took desperation. There's a difference. She hung up and called her sister Karen, who cried, which Sarah had expected, and then pulled herself together and offered to come to the hospital, which Sarah had also expected and which she accepted. She needed someone in that room with Connor who wasn't her, someone whose face Connor could look at without reading the terror that Sarah was working so hard to keep off her own. Karen had always been better at the surface. She was grateful for it today. Then she sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and thought about what came next. The thing she hadn't told Harrison, the thing she hadn't told anyone because she was still processing it herself, was the conversation with Henderson about Michael, about the phone call, about the last thing Henderson had said to her husband before he drove out into the ice storm and didn't come back. She had spent a lot of the night turning that over. Not in anger, she had moved past the stage of her grief, where anger was the primary color, but in something more complicated. The understanding that Michael's death was not the clean, simple accident she had framed it as for 7 years, not just weather and bad luck and timing, but also a chain of human choices of pride and pressure, and a voice on the phone that said, don't be a coward. The understanding that Thomas Henderson had been carrying that for 7 years too, had been carrying it alone and had handed it to her without being asked because he decided she deserved the truth. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She filed it in the place where she kept the things she wasn't ready to resolve and went back to her list. Henderson called at 8:45. We'll be there at 2, he said. No preamble, no greeting. How many can the ward handle? Sarah blinked. She had been thinking about a small group. 6, maybe 8. Enough to fill the room, enough for Connor to feel the reality of them. How many are you bringing? We put out the word last night, Henderson said. Spokane charter, obviously, but also Yakima, Tri-Cities, Bellingham. Couple of independents who knew your husband. A brief pause. Word travels fast when there's a reason. You might want to prepare the hospital for more than a few visitors. How many is more than a few? Somewhere north of 200, might be closer to 3. Sarah sat down. She hadn't been standing, but she sat down harder into the chair, as if her legs had made a decision without consulting her. 300 motorcycle. Give or take. Henderson's voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of a man for whom the logistics of moving 300 people was simply a problem to be solved. They won't all come inside. Most will stay with their bikes, but Connor will hear them. She thought about Connor in his hospital bed with the coin in his hand and the photograph on his nightstand, and she thought about what it would mean for him to hear 300 motorcycle engines in the parking lot of Spokane Memorial. She thought about the look on his face. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment and breathed through her nose. 2 o'clock, she said when she trusted her voice again. 2 o'clock, Henderson confirmed. Make sure the boy knows it's coming. She went back to Connor's room. He was awake better than he had been in days. The medication adjustment Harrison had ordered overnight was working, and he was sitting up with the television on low, though he wasn't really watching it. The coin was on the nightstand next to the photograph, precisely placed the way he kept the things that mattered. He looked at her when she came in and immediately read her face. Something happened, he said. 300 motorcycles, she said. Give or take. Connor stared at her. They put out the word last night, she said. Multiple charters. They're coming at 2 o'clock. He kept staring. His mouth opened slightly and then closed again. The television played on quietly behind him, a weather report, irrationally the forecast for the week, and Sarah watched her son try to process the information that 300 men on motorcycles were riding to Spokane Memorial Hospital because he had asked. Mom, Tom, he said finally. His voice was rough. 300. Henderson said it might be closer to 3. Connor turned his head away. She could see his jaw working, the muscle tightening the way it did when he was fighting something back. He reached out without looking and picked up the coin and closed his fist around it. Dad would have been one of them, he said quietly. Yes, Sarah said. He would have. Connor kept his face turned. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, still not looking at her, do you think he would have been proud of me? The question hit her in the sternum. She took 2 steps across the room and sat on the edge of his bed and put her arm around his thin shoulders and held him the way she had held him since he was small, the way that meant, I have you. I have you. Nothing gets past me to reach you. Every single day, she said into his hair, every single day of your life, Connor, I promise you. He leaned into her for a moment, just enough, and then straightened up and cleared his throat and said in a voice attempting normalcy, okay, what do I wear? She laughed. It surprised her, the realness of it, the way it broke out of her chest without asking permission. What do you want to wear? I don't know. Is there a thing like a dress code? Connor, you're the guest of honor. You can wear your hospital gown if you want. He made a face. Absolutely not. He thought for a moment. Can Karen bring my Seahawks hoodie? Sarah was already reaching for her phone. Patricia Voss arrived at 10:15 with a man from hospital security whose name tag said R. Kowalski and who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Voss herself had the tight, controlled expression of someone who had received information she found deeply unwelcome and had spent the morning deciding how to respond to it. Harrison was already in the room. He had positioned himself near the door with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that in institutional confrontations, location matters, and Sarah was grateful for it. Mrs. Bradley, Voss said, I've spoken with Dr. Harrison about the situation. I want to be very clear that what you've arranged without the hospital's knowledge or consent. I didn't arrange it without consent, Sarah said. I arranged it without your approval. Those are different things. Connor is my son, and he is a minor, and his wishes are my responsibility to honor, not yours. The hospital has a duty of care to all patients and staff. Then exercise it, Sarah said. Suem, we are not asking for the motorcycles to come inside. We are asking for a small number of representatives to visit a patient on this ward. The rest will be in the parking lot. Visible, yes. Loud, probably. But outside. She held Voss's gaze. Connor has at most a few weeks, possibly less. This is the only thing he has asked for, and it is happening at 2 o'clock today. The question for you is whether the hospital wants to be part of making it right, or whether you want to be the institution that tried to stop a dying 16-year-old from saying goodbye on his own terms. Kowalski from security was looking at the ceiling. Voss stood very still for a moment. The controlled expression shifted slightly, not into warmth exactly, but into something more honest. Something that acknowledged that she was standing in a pediatric oncology room in front of a boy with 1 leg and 74 pounds on his bones and a coin from his dead father in his hand, and that the policy manual had not prepared her for this specific situation. How many inside the ward? She said finally. 5, Sarah said. She had discussed this with Henderson, including Henderson himself. Another pause. Voss looked at Connor. Connor looked back at her with the straightforward, undemanding directness that was so much a part of him that Sarah sometimes forgot other people found it startling. Hi, Connor said. Voss blinked. Hello, Connor. I know this is a weird thing to ask for, he said. I'm not trying to make trouble, He stopped, thought about it. My dad was connected to this club. He died when I was 9. These guys knew him, and I want to know him a little better before He stopped again. He was very good at stopping. I just want to meet them, that's all. Patricia Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then she said to Sarah, 5 inside. They follow ward protocols, no alcohol, no smoking, and if any patient or staff member expresses discomfort, they are asked to leave immediately. Agreed, Sarah said. Voss left. Kowalski followed her. Harrison caught Sarah's eye across the room and gave her a very small nod. They had until 2 o'clock. The hours between 10 and 2 were strange and slow and fast at the same time, the particular temporal distortion of waiting for something that you know is coming and cannot rush. Karen arrived at 11 with the Seahawks hoodie and Connor's good sweatpants and a bag of snacks that Connor couldn't eat, but that she brought anyway, the way people bring food when they need something to do with their hands. She helped Connor get changed and then sat beside him, and they watched a game show together, bickering mildly about the answers the way they always had, and Sarah stood in the doorway and watched them and held onto the normalcy of it with everything she had. Donna came in at 12:30 to check Connor's vitals and adjust his IV line. She was a tall woman with a no-nonsense manner that Connor had taken to immediately the kind of nurse who talked to patients like adults regardless of their age, which Connor had always appreciated. Big day, Donna said, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. Yeah, Connor said. How are you feeling, honestly? Connor considered this with the seriousness he gave to all direct questions. Nervous, he said, which is stupid. Why would I be nervous? Because it matters, Donna said simply. Things that matter make you nervous. That's how you know they're real. She looked at the reading and made a note. Your pressure's good, better than yesterday. Good, Connor said. Then Donna, do you think they'll... He stopped, started again. Do you think they'll actually... Come, Donna said. Henderson called the nurses' station at 9 this morning to confirm the time and ask which entrance had the best access for someone in a wheelchair or on a gurney in case you needed to be moved. He wanted to know which window faced the parking lot so they could make sure you had line of sight to the bikes. She pulled the cuff off his arm. Yeah, Connor, they're coming. Connor pressed his lips together hard, nodded. Okay, he said. Okay, good. At 1:45, Sarah heard it. She was standing at the window of Connor's room, not watching, just standing, needing to be near the glass when the sound reached her. Distant at first, so low she thought she was imagining it. Then undeniable. The deep, resonant, layered sound of engines, not 1 or 2 or 10, but dozens, then more than dozens, building and multiplying the kind of sound that doesn't come from one source, but from a force. Connor, she said. He was already trying to sit up straighter. Karen was up and helping him, one arm behind his back, and he was craning toward the window with every bit of strength he had, his eyes wide and bright in a way she hadn't seen in months, a brightness that had nothing to do with medication and everything to do with being 16 and alive and hearing something that reached past the illness and the pain and the fear and grabbed him somewhere deeper. The engines grew and grew and kept growing. How many is that? Connor breathed. Not a question. A reckoning. A lot, Sarah said. Her voice was doing something she couldn't fully control. A lot, baby. And then before the full weight of it had even landed, before any of them had finished processing what 300 motorcycle engines sounded like arriving together in formation, there was a knock at the door. Rollins opened it. He was in his vest, clean jeans, his beard freshly trimmed. He looked into the room, found Connor, and whatever expression he'd come in with shifted into something quieter. Sergeant Rollins, Connor said. His voice was steady. Rollins blinked. You know who I am? My mom told me. Connor held out his hand. I'm Connor. Rollins crossed the room in 3 strides and shook it. He held Connor's hand a beat longer than a standard handshake, not squeezing, just holding, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something he was clearly not pleased about. Good to meet you, son, he said. His voice came out rougher than he probably intended. Behind Rollins, 4 other men filed into the room. Sarah recognized 2 of them from the night before. The last man through the door was Thomas Henderson. He was bigger in daylight than he had seemed in the dim back room of the clubhouse. He wore his vest and his iron gray beard and his direct blue eyes, and he walked into the hospital room of a dying 16-year-old boy the same way he probably walked into every room, like a man who had decided what he stood for a long time ago and had not been talked out of it since. He stopped at the foot of Connor's bed. They looked at each other, the old man and the boy, and the room held its breath. Connor Bradley, Henderson said. Thomas Henderson, Connor said. They call you Grizzly. The corner of Henderson's mouth moved. Your mother talked too much. She talks exactly the right amount, Connor said. She always has. Henderson looked at him for another moment. Then he pulled the chair from the corner of the room, not asking permission, not checking if it was all right, just picking it up and setting it down beside the bed and sitting in it, and he said, "Your dad and I used to argue about baseball." Connor's face did something complicated and then settled into attention. Yeah. He was a Mariners guy. I tried to explain to him many times that rooting for the Mariners was a form of voluntary suffering that no rational man should inflict on himself. Henderson's expression was grave. He disagreed loudly. Connor made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'm a Mariners guy too." "God help you," Henderson said. "It's hereditary. That explains everything." Outside, the engines were still running. The sound filled the room, filled the hospital, filled the November air over Spokane in a way that Sarah could feel in her chest, a deep mechanical heartbeat that the whole city could hear. Connor reached out and picked up the coin from his nightstand and held it, and Henderson saw him do it and said nothing, just watched. And the expression on the big man's face was the expression of someone paying a debt they had owed for a long time. "Tell me about him," Connor said. "Tell me something real. Not just, I know he wasn't perfect. Mom told me he had a temper. I don't need perfect. I just want real." Henderson was quiet for a moment. The engines outside rose and fell, the breathing of something vast and alive. "Real," Henderson said. "All right, here's real." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Your father, the first time he came to the clubhouse, showed up 20 minutes early. Not on time, early. In this world, that's either a sign of desperation or a sign of character. With Michael, it was character. He was the only man I ever saw apologize to a prospect he'd wronged and mean it. And I have known a lot of men." He looked at Connor steadily. "He was trying to become something your dad. He wasn't there yet, but he was trying, and the trying, that part was real." Connor closed his fist around the coin. "He would have made it," Connor said quietly. It wasn't a question. Henderson didn't look away. "Yes," he said, "I believe he would have." The engines outside swelled suddenly, all of them at once. A coordinated surge that was clearly intentional, clearly a signal, a sound like thunder that had decided to stay. And Connor turned toward the window, and his face opened up in a way that Sarah had not seen since before the diagnosis, since before everything changed, a pure and undefended joy that stripped away the illness and the pain in the 14 months of impossible courage and left only him. Just Connor, a 16-year-old boy, hearing something that moved him in a place beyond words. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Karen gripped her arm. Henderson watched Connor's face and said nothing and made no move to wipe the thing happening behind his own eyes. And the sound kept coming. It kept coming and coming, wave after wave, from the parking lot of Spokane Memorial Hospital. 300 men on motorcycles announcing themselves to a boy they had never met, honoring a father they had lost, keeping a promise that nobody had known needed keeping, until a woman in a rainstorm knocked on a door and refused to leave. Connor turned back from the window. His face was wet. He didn't try to hide it. "Thank you," he said. To Henderson, to all of them, to the room. "Thank you for coming." Henderson put his large hand over Connor's coin and all. "We were always going to come," he said. "We just needed someone to tell us where you were." Henderson's hand stayed over Connor's for a long moment, and nobody in the room moved or spoke, and the engines outside kept rolling through the November air, like something that had decided it was not going to be quiet about this. Then Connor took a breath, a careful one, the kind he had learned to take when his body reminded him of its limits, and said, "Can I go outside?" The question dropped into the room and landed differently on everyone. Karen looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Harrison, who had come back quietly at some point in the last 20 minutes and was standing near the door. Harrison looked at Connor. "Your oxygen levels have been stable today," Harrison said in the tone of a man working the problem in real time. "We'd need the portable unit, wheelchair, and it's cold out." "I know it's cold," Connor said. "I've been inside for 11 weeks. Harrison looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "Give me 10 minutes," and walked out. Henderson stood from the chair and looked at Rollins and made a small gesture with his chin. Rollins stepped out without a word. 2 of the other men followed. The room rearranged itself quietly around Connor, the way things did when Henderson was in charge of them, not because he issued orders, but because he had a clarity of direction that other people naturally oriented toward. You don't have to push yourself, Sarah said. She said it quietly, not as a prohibition, because she had stopped prohibiting things a long time ago. Mom, Connor looked at her. There are 300 motorcycles in the parking lot. For me. He held up the coin. Dad would have gone outside. She couldn't argue with that. She didn't try. Harrison came back in 9 minutes with Donna behind him, pushing a wheelchair with the portable oxygen unit clipped to the back, and 2 nurses from the station who had apparently decided on their own that they were part of this. Word had spread through the ward the way it always did in enclosed spaces, fast and sideways, nurse to nurse, aide to aide, and by the time they got Connor into the wheelchair and settled, there were 4 staff members in the corridor outside his room who had found reasons to be in that particular hallway at that particular moment, and not one of them was pretending otherwise. Donna attached the oxygen line and checked the levels with the brisk efficiency that was her default mode, then patted Connor's shoulder once firmly the way you'd reassure someone before they stepped into something big. Ready? She asked. Yeah, Connor said. Then wait. He reached back to the nightstand and picked up the photograph Michael and the laughing man in the vest and put it in the front pocket of his Seahawks hoodie. Then he looked at Henderson. Okay, now I'm ready. Henderson walked beside the wheelchair. Not behind it, not in front, beside it, the way you walk next to someone you're with. Sarah took the handles. Karen fell in on the other side. Harrison led the way. The small procession moved down the corridor of the oncology ward, and the nurses who had found reasons to be in the hallway stepped back to make room, and 2 of them were not doing a very good job of keeping their faces professional, and one of them didn't try at all. They rode the elevator down in silence. Henderson stood in the corner of the elevator with his arms at his sides and his eyes forward, and Connor sat in the wheelchair looking up at the elevator panel watching the numbers, and somewhere between the 4th floor and the ground floor, he reached up without looking, and Henderson put his hand down and Connor gripped it for exactly the duration of the ride and then let go when the doors opened. Neither of them mentioned it. The sound hit them for the doors at the end of the ground floor corridor even opened. Not just sound, physical presence, the kind of low-frequency vibration that you feel in your back teeth in the center of your chest. 300 engines idling in formation, and the building itself was conducting it through the floors, through the walls, through the wheelchair, under Connor's legs, and Connor sat up straighter as they moved toward it, his whole body orienting toward the sound, the way something orients toward its source. Rollins was waiting at the exterior door. He pushed it open and held it, and the sound came through like something released, and Connor made a sound of his own. Not words, just a single exhaled note of pure reaction, and Sarah's hands tightened on the wheelchair handles, and she pushed him through. The cold hit them. The air and the sound together, the November air sharp and clean, after 11 weeks of filtered hospital atmosphere, and Connor pulled in a breath of it like he was drinking it. His eyes went wide and stayed wide. The parking lot of Spokane Memorial was full, not just full transformed. Motorcycles in every direction lined up in formation with a precision that didn't look accidental riders standing beside their bikes or sitting on them, and when the doors opened, and Connor came through, something moved through the crowd, a ripple of awareness passing person to person, and the engine surged. All of them. Together. A coordinated rise in volume that was clearly intentional, clearly a greeting, clearly the motorcycle equivalent of a standing ovation. And it lasted for 10 full seconds and then settled back to idle. And in those 10 seconds, Connor Bradley gripped the arms of his wheelchair so hard, his knuckles went white. And his face did something that Sarah was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. Pure, absolute, undefended joy. Oh my God, he said. It came out barely above a whisper, but Sarah heard it because she was right behind him, and she had spent 16 years learning the full register of his voice. Oh my God, Mom. I know, baby, she said, I know. A man Sarah didn't recognize came forward from the front of the formation. Older, silver-haired, with a beard that reached his second vest button and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had been outside and in motion for most of his life. He stopped in front of the wheelchair and looked at Connor. Ray Cutter, he said. Yakima Charter. I rode with your dad. Twice, maybe 3 times. He told a terrible joke about a duck in a hardware store that I still cannot get out of my head. He held out his hand. Honor to meet you, son. Connor shook it. He was trying to say something and not quite getting there, so he just shook Ray Cutter's hand and nodded, and Cutter seemed to understand that completely because he nodded back and stepped aside. Another man came forward, Then another, not all 300. It wasn't a receiving line. It wasn't organized. It was more organic than that. Men stepping forward one or two at a time with something to say or just to stand close and acknowledge. And Connor met each one with the same straightforward steadiness that had carried him through 14 months of things no 16-year-old should have to carry. Henderson stood slightly behind and to the right of the wheelchair the entire time, and Sarah realized after a few minutes that he had positioned himself there deliberately close enough to intervene if Connor needed it far enough back that the moment wasn't about him. She was going to remember that. A man named Ortega from the Bellingham Charter crouched down to Connor's eye level and said, "We heard about you from Henderson at 11 last night. I was in bed. I got up, called 6 guys, and we were on the road by 1 in the morning. 4 hours in the dark and the rain." He shrugged. "Worth it." Connor stared at him. "You rode 4 hours." "Some of the Tri-Cities guys rode 5, Ortega said. "Don't be too impressed by me." "You rode 5 hours in the rain in November," Connor said to no one in particular, or to all of them. "For me," Kid and Ortega said, "we'd have ridden to the coast." Connor pressed his lips together. His jaw worked. He turned his face away for a moment, and the coin was in his hand. Sarah didn't know when he'd taken it out, but it was there, and when he turned back, his eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice was steady. "My dad," he said. Did he ever talk about me?" It was the question he'd been carrying. Sarah heard it hit the air and understood immediately that this was what the entire journey had been about. Not the bikes, not the leather, not the mythology. This, did he talk about me? Did I exist for him? Was I real in the part of his life I never got to see? Ortega looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "He carried a picture, wallet photo. You were maybe 3, 4 years old, sitting on a motorcycle, somebody's bike not running, and you had the biggest helmet they could find, and it was falling over your eyes and you were laughing." He paused. He showed that picture to anyone who would look at it. "I saw it probably 6 times. He met Connor's gaze. "Yeah, son, he talked about you." Connor made a sound then that he couldn't control and didn't try to. It wasn't crying exactly, it was something more compressed than that. Something that had been held too long, under too much pressure, and finally found an exit. He bent forward in the wheelchair and put his fist against his mouth and just breathed through it, and Henderson put one hand on his shoulder and kept it there, and the engines idled around them like a vast mechanical heartbeat, keeping time. Sarah stood behind the wheelchair and looked up at the sky and breathed. After a minute, Connor straightened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the unself-conscious gesture of a boy who had not yet learned to be embarrassed about feeling things. He cleared his throat. He looked out at the rows of bikes and the men standing beside them and the gray November sky above all of it. "Can I sit on one?" he said. Rollins had the nearest bike, a big dark machine that he had ridden in from somewhere and parked in the front row. He looked at Harrison. Harrison looked at Connor's portable oxygen unit and the wheelchair and the logistics of what was being proposed, and then said in the tone of a man who had made a decision he was at peace with carefully. It took 4 of them. Rollins, Henderson, a man named Torres from the Spokane Charter, and Harrison himself working together with a focused, careful attention to get Connor Bradley out of the wheelchair and onto the seat of Rollins' motorcycle. They did it slowly and without any of them making a production of it. No false encouragement, no dramatic narration, just 4 men making sure the kid got where he wanted to be safely. Connor settled onto the seat. He put both hands on the handlebars. He was thin and pale, and the Seahawks hoodie was too big for him now, and his right leg ended below the knee in the special prosthetic they had fitted 3 months ago, and that he was still learning, and he sat on that motorcycle in the cold parking lot of a Spokane hospital, and he was unmistakably exactly where he was supposed to be. He looked up. His eyes moved across the rows of bikes and the men beside them, taking it all in, not rushing it, letting himself have the full measure of it. Then he looked at Henderson. "Is this what it feels like?" he asked. "Sitting on yours, I mean. Is this the feeling?" As Henderson looked at him. "What feeling?" "Like you're going somewhere," Connor said. "Even when you're standing still. Like you could just..." He gestured forward with one hand, a small, contained gesture toward the open street beyond the parking lot. "Like you could just go." Henderson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like." Connor nodded slowly. "I get it now," he said. "I get why he wanted this." He put both hands back on the bars. "I get why he wanted to be part of something that feels like that." Nobody said anything. The engines idled. The cold air moved. Then Rollins leaned over and said quietly, "You want to hear it? Really hear it up close?" Connor looked at him. "Yeah." Rollins reached past him and keyed the ignition, and the bike under Connor came alive. A deep, immediate vibration that moved through the frame and into the seat and up through Connor's whole body, and Connor sucked in a breath and laughed, a real laugh, sudden and involuntary, the laugh of someone who has been surprised by delight. And then, as if that one engine was a signal, as if 300 riders had been waiting for exactly that sound, the parking lot erupted. Every bike at once, not idling, running, full-throated and coordinated and overwhelming a wall of sound that went past noise and became something elemental, something that stopped being about motorcycles and became about force and solidarity, in the particular way that people who have decided to show up for someone show up completely without reservation, holding nothing back. Connor threw his head back. His face was turned to the gray sky and his mouth was open and his eyes were closed and he was laughing and crying at the same time, fully and without apology, and the sound rolled over him and through him, and the coin was in his fist and the photograph was in his pocket, and his father was not there. But his father was everywhere, in Henderson's hand on his shoulder, and in the wallet photo Ortega had described, and in the engine vibrating through the frame of the bike under him, and in the 30 bikers who had ridden 5 hours in the rain. Michael Bradley had not been there for this moment, but every man in that parking lot had made sure that Michael Bradley was present anyway. Sarah watched her son and did not try to hold herself together. She was done trying to hold herself together. She stood behind the wheelchair that sat empty now, and she let her hands hang at her sides, and she felt it in the grief, in the gratitude, in the bone-deep exhaustion, and underneath all of it, something else. Something she had not expected to feel in a hospital parking lot in November. Something that pushed up against the loss and refused to be overwhelmed by it. Pride. Staggering, absolute, inarticulate pride, not in anything she had done, but in Connor. In who he was. In the fact that this boy, this specific, irreplaceable boy, had chosen this. Had known what he needed. Had trusted her to find a way to give it to him. Had sat on that motorcycle in the cold and turned his face up and let himself receive something freely and without guilt, which was the hardest thing she had ever watched anyone do. Karen's hand found hers. Sarah gripped it. Henderson was watching Connor. His profile was turned towards Sarah, and she could see the line of it, the hard jaw, the iron gray beard, the set of a man who did not perform emotion, but occasionally let it surface when he decided it had earned the right. It had earned the right now. He looked at Connor the way you look at something you've been given an unexpected chance to make, right? And the making right is not complete and never will be completely, but it is real and it is here and it is something. Donna appeared at Sarah's elbow. She had come outside at some point without Sarah noticing, and she stood there with her arms crossed against the cold, and her professional face was entirely gone. 11 years on this ward, she said, not quite to Sarah, more to the air in front of her. I have never seen anything like this. Neither have I, Sarah said. He's doing well. Vitals are good. Heart rate is up, but it's the good kind of up. Donna paused. We can give him more time out here if he wants it. Sarah looked at Connor, who had one hand on the handlebar and one hand raised toward Ortega in some kind of exchange she couldn't hear over the engines, and who was grinning, actually grinning, the full unguarded grin she had not seen since before any of this started, and she said, give him all the time he wants. It was Henderson who finally came to her. He crossed the few feet between them and stood beside her, and they watched Connor together for a moment, without speaking, the way two people watch something when words are not the right instrument. Then Henderson said, he's going to be okay. Sarah turned to look at him. He was still watching Connor. His voice had been quiet and certain the way he said most things. I know he's not going to be okay in the way that means. Henderson stopped, chose different words. I know what the doctors say. I mean, he's okay right now, in himself. He knows who he is. A pause. A lot of men twice his age never get there. Sarah looked back at her son. He got it from his mother, Henderson said. Just so you know. She didn't answer that. She couldn't. But she felt it land, and she held on to it because there were going to be days, a lot of them stretching forward from this one, when she was going to need something to hold on to, and she was going to take everything that was offered. Connor stayed on the motorcycle for 22 minutes. Nobody timed it officially, but Sarah counted because she always counted, and it was 22 minutes of engines and cold air, and Connor's face turned towards something bigger than himself, and finding that it fit. When Harrison finally touched her arm and said gently that they should think about getting Connor inside, she nodded. Henderson was already moving back to the wheelchair. Rollins and Torres were already positioning themselves. Connor let himself be helped down. He was tired. She could see it the moment the adrenaline began to ebb, the way the weight came back into his body and his shoulders dropped slightly. But he was a different kind of tired than he had been for months. Not the grinding, gray exhaustion of illness. The clean, earned tiredness of a person who has spent themselves on something that mattered. He settled back into the wheelchair. He looked up at Henderson. "I need to ask you something," Connor said. "Ask," Henderson said. "The cut." Connor's voice was careful, deliberate. "The leather vest. I know it means something specific. I know it's not something you just give away." He held Henderson's gaze. "Is there any version of this where I could—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Is there something I could earn? Even now I know I can't prospect. I know I can't ride, but is there—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Henderson looked at him for a long measuring moment. Then he looked over his shoulder at Rollins, who was already reaching into the saddlebag on his bike. Rollins pulled out a cut, a leather vest worn at the edges and soft with age, with a death's head patch on the back and the Spokane tab below it. He held it out to Henderson. Henderson took it. He held it for a moment looking at it, and then he looked at Connor. "This belonged to your father," he said. "He earned it in Prospect. He never got to full patch. He was gone before that. But the cut was his. I've had it since the accident." He paused. "I was keeping it until I knew who to give it to." The parking lot had gone quieter, engines dropping to a lower idle or shutting off entirely, men turning toward what was happening near the door. An instinctive collective attention. Henderson shook the cut open and held it out. Connor leaned forward in the wheelchair and put his arms through the sleeves. The leather settled over his Seahawks hoodie, heavy and real, and it was too big for him. Of course it was too big. Connor weighed 74 pounds, and Michael had been a solidly built man, but that only made it mean more somehow. The way it hung on him, the way the patches sat on thin shoulders that had carried more than they looked like they could hold. Connor straightened up in the wheelchair. He put both hands on the armrests. He was wearing his father's cut, and his father's coin was in his hand, and his father's photograph was in his pocket, and the engines around him were breathing like something alive. Every man in that parking lot who could see him was on his feet. Nobody organized it. Nobody called for it. 300 men in leather vests standing for a 16-year-old boy in a wheelchair outside a hospital in Spokane, Washington, in November because he had asked to meet them, and they had come, and the rest had happened the way things happen when you show up honestly for something that matters. Connor looked out at them. He raised the coin. Michael's coin, the death's head, silver coin that had traveled from the accident scene to Henderson's pocket, to Sarah's hand, to Connor's fist, and he held it up. The engine surged one more time. Together. The sound rolled out across the parking lot and the hospital and the street beyond and the rooftops of Spokane. And it was loud enough that people 2 blocks away stopped what they were doing and looked up, and it lasted for 15 seconds. And in those 15 seconds, Connor Bradley sat in his father's womb and held his father's coin in the air and received something that no hospital administration and no policy manual and no institutional liability concern had been able to prevent. His inheritance, late, imperfect, real. They got Connor back inside at 4:17. Sarah knew the exact time because she looked at the clock on the wall of his room when they came through the door, the same reflex that had governed 14 months of her life. Mark the time, know where you are, keep track of what is happening, because if you stop tracking it, something will slip past you, and you cannot afford that. 4:17. Connor had been outside for 41 minutes in November air with a portable oxygen unit in his father's leather cut and 300 men standing in formation around him, and his cheeks were red from the cold and his eyes were exhausted, and he was more alive than he had been in months. Donna got him back into bed with the efficient tenderness she brought to everything. Vitals check, oxygen line repositioned, blanket straightened. Connor submitted to all of it without protest, which meant he was genuinely tired because Connor's default setting in the face of medical management was polite but determined resistance. Henderson came back inside with Rollins. They stood near the door, not intruding, giving the medical routine its space. Connor watched them from the bed while Donna worked, keeping them in his eye line as if he was making sure they were still real. "You're staying?" Connor asked Henderson when Donna stepped back. For a while, Henderson said. If that's all right. That's all right, Connor said. He settled deeper into the pillow. The leather cut was folded over the back of the chair beside his bed. His specific instruction when they laid it aside had been to make sure he could see it from where he was lying. It was draped over the chair now, with the death's head patch facing him. I want to hear more about him, he said. About my dad, if you have more. Henderson pulled the chair from the corner, the same chair he'd taken the first time, same deliberate motion, and sat down. Rollins stayed near the door and across the posture of a man comfortable with being present without being central. What do you want to know? Henderson said. Connor thought about it. It was a real consideration, not a rhetorical one. He was deciding the way he decided things carefully and without waste. The things you remember that have nothing to do with the club, he said finally. Not the vest, not the bikes, just him. The regular stuff. What was he like on a regular day? Henderson looked at the ceiling for a moment, searching. He made coffee like it was a punishment, he said. Strongest, worst coffee I have ever consumed in my life. Every single time. And he would hand it to you with this expression like he had just done you a significant favor. He shook his head. I used to pour it out when he wasn't looking. Connor smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and private, the smile of someone filing something away. Mom says he was the same way. She says she had to hide the good coffee. Smart woman, Henderson said. Yeah, Connor said. She really is. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed near Connor's feet, and she heard this exchange and she did not say anything, but she put her hand on the blanket over his ankle and left it there. Karen had stepped out to get food from the cafeteria that nobody was actually going to eat, which was her way of giving the room space to be what it needed to be. Harrison had checked in once more and then made himself absent with the same skilled discretion. Donna had promised to be at the station 20 feet away and not to leave the floor. The afternoon settled. The sound of the motorcycles in the parking lot had been dropping off gradually, not all at once, but in clusters, charters making their way back to Yakima and Bellingham and Tri-Cities as the day edged toward evening. But some of them were still out there. Sarah could hear the occasional low rumble through the window, and she understood without being told that some of them had decided to stay as long as Connor was awake. Henderson told stories. He told them the way men of his particular generation tell stories economically, without embellishment, trusting the material to carry its own weight. He told Connor about a run to the coast, that Michael had been part of his second month as a prospect when the weather turned bad, and they'd sheltered in a roadside diner for 4 hours, and Michael had ended up in a debate with the cook about the designated hitter rule that grew so animated the other customers had started taking sides. He told Connor about a night Michael had sat with a club member whose wife had just left him, sat with him until 3 a.m, saying very little, just being present because that was what was needed. He told Connor about the time Michael had fixed an old woman's flat tire in a rainstorm with no request for thanks and no audience, and no reason except that it needed doing. Connor listened to all of it with his eyes half closed and the coin moving slowly through his fingers, the way he had been doing for hours, not fidgeting, more like keeping contact with something, maintaining connection through touch, when everything else was getting further away. At one point, he said without opening his eyes fully, "He sounds like he was trying to be good." He was, Henderson said. He didn't always get it right, but the trying was constant. I'll give him that. That's enough, Connor said. That's enough to be. The room was quiet for a while after that. Outside, a motorcycle engine started and then faded as it pulled away from the lot, and then another, and the sound became sparser, more distant, the way a storm sounds as it moves off. Connor opened his eyes and looked at Henderson directly. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Do you believe in anything after this? He didn't gesture at himself or the room or the hospital. He just said this, and Henderson understood him. Henderson was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of avoidance, the quiet of a man giving the question what it deserved. I believe in what stays, he said finally. I've watched a lot of men go, and what I've seen is that the ones who lived like something mattered, the way they treated people, the things they stood for, that stays. In the people around them, in the stories. He met Connor's eyes. Your dad is in that room right now. He's been in it all day. That's not nothing. Connor was quiet. The coin turned in his fingers. I think so too, he said. I felt him today. I didn't want to say that out loud because it sounds, he paused. But I felt him today. Don't apologize for that, Henderson said. Ever. Connor nodded. His eyes were getting heavier. The medication was at work the long afternoon catching up with his body's limits, and Sarah watched the effort it took him to stay present the way he kept pulling himself back from the edge of sleep because he wasn't ready to go there yet. Henderson, he said, yeah. Will you come back? The question was simple and direct, the way all of Connor's important questions were. Not today, but after. Will you come back? Henderson didn't answer immediately, and the pause was not hesitation. It was gravity. The weight of a man understanding exactly what was being asked and deciding to answer it with the same honesty he had brought to everything else. Yes, he said. I'll come back. Good, Connor said. And then his eyes closed, and this time they stayed closed, and within 3 minutes his breathing had slowed into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep. Henderson sat for another 10 minutes without moving. Then he stood quietly and replaced the chair in the corner and looked at Sarah across the sleeping boy between them. Sarah stood up. She walked him to the door. In the corridor, with Rollins a respectful distance away, Henderson turned to her. He's extraordinary, he said. It wasn't a platitude. It was an assessment delivered the way he delivered everything, straight and without decoration. I know, Sarah said. You made that. He met her eyes. Whatever he is, you made it. Under circumstances that would have broken most people. Sarah looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say in response to that. The deflections, the modest disclaimers, the redirections to Connor's own character. She had used all of them before reflexively because she had spent so long keeping her own needs small so Connor's could stay large. Instead, she said, thank you for coming, not just today, for what you told me about Michael, for keeping that coin. She paused. You didn't have to carry any of that. You chose to. I want you to know I understand the difference. Henderson looked at her for a moment. Then he put out his hand and she shook it, and he held it for a beat, the same beat Connor had taken in the elevator. The same beat Rollins had held Connor's hand when they first met, and then he let go. You need anything, he said. Anything at all. You call the clubhouse. He paused. Not the administration, not the policy line. You call and ask for me. She nodded. He and Rollins walked down the corridor. At the elevator, Henderson turned back, once not for a wave or a parting word, just a look, a direct, honest acknowledgement, and then the doors opened, and they were gone. Sarah stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went back into Connor's room and sat in the chair that Henderson had left in the corner and listened to her son breathe. The next 8 days were quieter than any of them expected. Not peaceful quiet was not the same as peaceful, and Sarah had stopped confusing the two a long time ago. Connor's pain increased. Harrison adjusted medications and then adjusted them again, and the conversations about what was coming became more explicit and more frequent, the way those conversations always did, as the timeline compressed. Dr. Harrison was honest about it, the way he was honest about everything, and Sarah was grateful for that honesty, the way you're grateful for solid ground when everything around you is soft. Henderson came back. He came on the third day alone without announcement and sat with Connor for 2 hours. Connor was mostly awake for the first hour and mostly not for the second, and Henderson sat through both without apparent difference in his level of attention. He brought a photograph printed, not digital, because he seemed like a man who understood that some things needed to be physical of Michael from the early days of his prospect period, standing next to a bike with the ease of someone who had been around them all his life. Connor held the photograph with both hands for a long time and then asked Henderson to set it on the nightstand next to the one of Michael and the laughing man, and Henderson placed it carefully, precisely, and stepped back. Rollins came on the 5th day with Ray Cutter from the Yakima Charter, the man who had remembered the wallet photo, the picture of baby Connor on the motorcycle with the oversized helmet. Rollins was characteristically quiet, and Cutter talked easily, telling more stories, and Connor drifted in and out of them. But when he surfaced, he always surfaced, smiling, which Sarah cataloged and kept. Karen stayed. Das har jag stayed. She had called her work and arranged what needed to be arranged, and she simply stayed sleeping on the family lounge couch and eating terrible cafeteria food and being exactly what she had always been, the person beside Sarah when the load got too heavy for one pair of hands. On the 7th day, Connor asked Sarah to read to him. They had not done this since he was small bedtime stories in the narrow bedroom of the Sprague Avenue house, his back against her chest, her voice going on until she wasn't sure if he was awake or asleep, because the breathing was so slow and even. She hadn't brought a book, she hadn't thought of it or hadn't let herself think of it because thinking of it would have meant admitting they were heading here. But she looked around the room and found, in the small stack of things Karen had brought from home, a worn paperback copy of a Jack London collection that Connor had read in ninth grade and apparently loved enough to keep. She read to him for an hour. He didn't sleep. He lay with his eyes closed and the leather cut draped over his blanket. He'd asked for it there 3 days ago, draped across him like a second blanket, and it had stayed there since, and the coin in his hand, always the coin, and he listened. When she stopped, his eyes opened. "Mom, yeah, I'm not scared," he said. "I want you to know that. I know you worry about whether I'm scared, so I want you to actually know I'm not." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "I believe you." "It's because of Dad," he said. "I know that sounds, I don't mean it in a mystical way. I just mean today I know more about him than I ever thought I would. I know what he tried to be. I know he thought about me." He turned the coin. "I know the men he called brothers drove 5 hours in the rain to stand in a parking lot for me." He looked at her. "How could I be scared when I know all that? How could I be scared when I come from all that?" Sarah put the book down. She moved to the edge of his bed and took his free hand in both of hers. "You come from more than that," she said. "You come from every morning I drove you to school, and every fever I sat up through, and every bad day I helped you find the other side of. You come from Karen teaching you to cook, and Dr. Harrison fighting for every day we had, and Donna straightening your blanket at midnight, even when you pretended you didn't want her to." She held his hand tighter. "You come from everyone who loved you, and there are more of us than you know, Connor. There are so many more of us than you know." He looked at her. His eyes were wet, and he didn't hide it. "I know, Mom," he said. "I know." He slept after that, and Sarah sat beside him and held his hand, and the afternoon moved through the window, and the light changed the way it does in November early, and gold, and then gone, and she sat with him as it went. Henderson came back on the 8th day. He hadn't called ahead. He came in the late morning when Connor was awake but barely surfacing and submerging in that rhythm that had become his way of being in the world, now present for stretches, then away, then present again like a tide. Henderson sat in the corner chair and didn't say much, and Connor knew he was there because he said his name once without opening his eyes. "Henderson." "Right here," Henderson said. "Good," Connor said, and went back under. At 2 in the afternoon, Sarah stepped out for 10 minutes. She went to the family lounge and sat and drank a cup of coffee and let herself be nowhere in particular. No role, no task, no vigil. Just a woman in a chair with a cup of coffee, existing without purpose for 10 minutes, which was the closest thing to rest she had allowed herself in days. When she came back, Henderson was still in the corner. Connor's breathing had changed. She knew it immediately. Not from any medical knowledge, though she had accumulated significant medical knowledge in 14 months. She knew it the way you know things that live in the body rather than the mind. The knowledge of a mother who had spent more hours listening to this particular person breathe than she had spent sleeping. She went to the bed and took his hand. She nodded at Henderson, who stood and went to the door and said something quietly to Donna, who called Harrison. Karen came. Harrison came. Donna stayed in the doorway. The room gathered itself into the shape of a goodbye. Connor surfaced once more, his eyes open, not fully, not with the brightness of the parking lot or the clarity of the conversations with Henderson, but enough. He found his mother's face. He always found her face. "Hey," he said. His voice was very small. "Hey, baby," she said. His fingers moved around the coin. Still there, still in his hand. "Tell Henderson I'll..." He stopped, breathed. "Tell him thank you for keeping the coin, for keeping it until..." He stopped again. "I'll tell him," Sarah said. "He's right here." Connor's eyes moved to the corner. Henderson had come back to the bedside. He was standing at the foot of the bed, and his face was the face of a man who has seen loss before and has never learned to be at ease with it and has stopped trying. "Good ride," Connor said to him. The words were barely audible. Henderson put his hand on Connor's foot over the blanket over the leather cut. "Good ride, son," he said. His voice was steady, and it cost him everything to keep it that way. Connor's eyes went to his mother. They stayed there. "I love you," she said. She said it the way you say the only thing that matters, simply without performance, because it was not for anyone but him. His mouth moved. She heard it even without volume. I know. It was the last thing he said. He went quietly the way he had done everything at the end, without drama, without struggle on his own terms, with his father's coin in his hand, and his father's leather cut across his chest and his mother's hand in his, and the distant fading sound of a motorcycle engine somewhere beyond the window. One of the last of them, leaving carrying something forward into the world that he had given it. Sarah sat with him for a long time. Henderson didn't leave. Karen didn't leave. Donna stood in the doorway and nobody asked her to go. There was no good thing to say about the silence that followed. Sarah didn't look for one. But there was something in the room that she had not expected and could not explain, and did not try to a quality of completion, not of loss alone, but of something finished in the right way at the right time with the right people present. Connor had gotten what he asked for. He had received his father. He had received his inheritance. He had known in the last days of his life that he came from something real, and that the something real had shown up for him when it mattered. She held his hand and she let herself feel all of it. The grief and the love and the gratitude and the outrage and the unbearable tendernesses of having been this boy's mother. And she did not try to sort it or manage it or move through it faster than it wanted to move. She let it be exactly as big as it was. Henderson left the room at some point. He didn't say goodbye. He came back 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway and said quietly, "The remaining bikes, they want to," he paused. "If it's all right." Sarah looked up. "They want to do a final pass," Henderson said, "through the lot for him." She nodded. She heard it 2 minutes later. Not 300, maybe 20, maybe 30, the ones who had stayed or come back or never left. It was enough. The sound came through the window like a wave rose, held, then faded as they moved away, and then came back again from the other direction. The last pass, the final loop, a circle completed. Connor's coin was still in his hand. Sarah reached over and gently, carefully closed his fingers around it more fully. She thought about leaving it with him. She thought about what it meant, that coin, the years it had traveled Henderson's pocket to her hand to Connor's fist, and she thought about Michael driving into the ice storm and Henderson on the phone and all the choices and all the years and all the roads that had led to this room and this boy and this moment. She left the coin with him. It had traveled far enough. It was home. 3 weeks later, at the memorial service for Connor Bradley, held not in a church but in the parking lot of Spokane Memorial Hospital, because Sarah could not think of a more honest place, and because it was where she most fully understood who her son had been. Thomas Henderson stood up and said 4 sentences. He said Connor Bradley was 16 years old, and he knew exactly who he was and exactly what he needed, and he was not afraid to ask for it. He said that kind of courage does not come from illness or from dying. It comes from how a person was raised and who they chose to be. He said, "I knew his father, and I am glad I got to know his son." And then he said, looking at Sarah directly, Michael Bradley would not believe what this woman made out of everything she was given. And he would not be surprised by a single moment of it. Sarah stood in the cold November air of that parking lot and heard those words, and she held them the way Connor had held the coin with both hands, with the full weight of what they meant, with no intention of ever letting them go. 31 motorcycles were parked in formation behind the speaker's podium. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had sent out a notice or issued an instruction. They had simply come the way they had come the first time because someone needed them, and they had decided that was enough of a reason. Connor Bradley had asked to meet the HELLS Angels. They had come to him in the hundreds, and they had stood in the cold, and they had given him his father, and they had stayed until he was gone, and they had come back for his memorial service on a Tuesday in November, because that was what you did for one of your own. He had been 16 years old and 74 pounds and one leg, and more courage than most men accumulate in a lifetime. He had known what he needed, and he had trusted his mother to find it, and she had walked into the rain and knocked on a door and refused to leave, and the door had opened. That is not a small thing. That is not an ordinary thing. That is the kind of thing that happens when people decide that the person in front of them matters more than the policy behind them, when the size of someone's love turns out to be larger than the size of the obstacle in its way. Connor Bradley got his wish. He got his father. He got his inheritance. He went out of this world wearing the cut his father earned and holding the coin his father carried, and knowing fully, completely, without a shadow of doubt, that he was loved by more people than he had ever counted. And that is not a small life. That is not a life that came up short. That is a life that was whole.